So Pan, are you letting people in? Okay, I'll let them in. Okay, here we go. Here we go. Uh, uh, Admit all. There we go. Okay. Okay, wonderful, wonderful. Welcome everyone to our Thursday Lenten series. We are the Episcopal Women's History Project. We sponsor this. And before I begin anything else, I would like to begin with prayer. O God, creator of all life, bless the unsung lives of countless Christian women in every century who were your hands and feet, who kept alive your compassionate presence by feeding the hungry, nursing the sick, clothing the naked, comforting the sad, praying and petitioning, strengthening those in prison, teaching the stories, sowing and singing, weeping and rejoicing. Grant us the wisdom to discern our ministries in this day as our foremothers found theirs. Lead us in new and timeless forms of discipleship, and let us joyfully find our place in this procession of praise, offering our very gifts and voices together with them and Mary, the mother of our Savior Jesus Christ. Amen. Again, welcome to each and every one of you. We have an exciting, wonderful presentation today. A team from Zion Episcopal Church in the Diocese of Long Island, New York, will tell the story of Margaret and Elsye Pine, two women who were enslaved by church founders. They will talk about how they came upon the graves of Margaret and Elsie, and also how important it is to name what's wonderful that we know about these two women and painful at the same time, that we know so little about them and the many other enslaved people by Zion's founders. I will turn this over. We're going to have several speakers today, and I'm going to turn this over to their team, and Mother Lindsay, who will begin.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for being here. It's an honor to share this story. So I am here with the Zion History Project, which is a ministry of the parish of Zion Episcopal Church. We are in Queens, New York, which is probably the most familiar way to say it. But throughout the presentation, you'll hear reference to our neighborhood as both Douglaston and Little Neck. So that's the specific village we're in the borough of Queens in New York City. And of course, we are in the Diocese of Long Island. So Zion was founded in 1830, and we've always seen ourselves as a historic parish. But as much as we've seen ourselves that way, and we have published many, many, many parish histories over the years, that history has been incomplete. But that's about to change, or that's changing now, as you're about to learn. How this got started was back in 2006, General Convention had a resolution that was adopted that called on all Episcopal congregations to explore whether they have a history of complicity in the institution of slavery. And our current presiding bishop, Michael Curry, renewed that call as part of the ministry of becoming beloved community. So churches around the church, parishes around the church, have been doing this work for 4 or 5 years now. We are very blessed to have some avid researchers who, before we even got involved with our diocesan history project, had already started to do this work. Both our assistant rector and our warden, who are part of this team today, they love sleuthing, and we're so grateful for that. And we didn't have to dig very deeply to uncover our ties to American slavery. But even though it wasn't hidden too deeply, it was never told in any of the multitudinous histories that we've published in the last 194 years. So today we're going to share some of the things we have discovered. And I hope that we will not only honor the memories of Margaret Pine and Elsye Pine, that also that you will hear in our story about how our research of our history has been breaking open new ways for us to be in the world and to look at our future. So I'd like to introduce one of the members of the Zion History Project, Giselle Habibullah.
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm incredibly grateful to have this opportunity to speak with all of you today. So I am Giselle Habibullah, a member of the Zion Church Memorials Committee. I've grown up with Zion Church, and so for what is essentially the 17 years that I've spent with the Zion community, my understanding of our church had been very restricted to just present time. However, around December of 2022, Father Carl invited me to join the Memorials Committee, which is essentially a committee aiming to honor the enslaved people that may have been overlooked in the history of Zion Church. So our goal over these past few years has been to educate ourselves and our church community on the history behind Zion and the significant role that slave labor had played in the construction of our church. We had to grapple with the past, including pieces that are quite disheartening, and I admit exploring this deep and sometimes painful history was not an easy task. But we find it to be our responsibility to foster a community that is willing to learn from our history and grow through reflection and strive for a more just future. By acknowledging the uncomfortable truths of our past, we honor the voices and experiences of those who were marginalized and often silenced. I believe that this is a gesture of respect to individuals who, despite being an integral part of our church's history, were historically overlooked or forgotten. We have chosen to extend our journey on the history of Zion to the hardships of women. This is a journey rooted in the desire to deepen our understanding of our faith and to uncover the threads that weave us together as Episcopal tradition. Today is not merely a historical exploration, but a chance to find a deeper and more meaningful connection between each other. And so, as we stand here united in purpose, we find ourselves in the sacred season of Lent. I find that it is no coincidence that we present our discoveries during this reflective period, since Lent is a time of introspection and a call to renew our commitment to God and one another. So our presentation is not just a sharing of historical information, but also a testament to the spiritual growth that we all collectively seek. And with that, I will introduce Tula.
Okay, hello everyone. My name is Tula Lacey, and I've been a member of this organization for the past 3 or 4 years. And I've been so impressed with all the presenters who have come in and they shared their story. They've given of themselves to talk about things that are really important for Christian women and how we can live our lives. So when I was listening to some of the presentations, especially the ones in the early 1800s, there was something that just hit me and it struck me, and it really stayed in my heart. When I heard the presentations, and they were really very thorough, I really didn't hear any mention of people who looked like me. And that was disturbing to me. And I knew that people who looked like me were there at that time and were participating in society in some way, shape, or form, but they were just not talked about. So knowing that people of color have experienced racism for many, many, many years, and today our history in America is still seen that people of color, especially Africans, people from Africa, are still seen as, the history is erased, ignored, dehumanized, compromised, and really rewritten to appease others. And this has been going on, and it's still distressingly going on today. So I wanted to really bring this story that our team at Zion is doing to the Episcopal Women's Project, because I think it's so important to share what we've learned and to honor those who have come before us. So I come from a long line of Louisiana women, and honestly, I know maybe one or two people ahead of me, but there's so many women's stories that have gotten lost. And I think that this story, the stories we're going to be telling about Margaret and Elsye Pine, I feel that as a woman of color, that I'm living through them. And even though they didn't get all the credit that they deserved when they were alive, I think we are honoring them by really telling their story. And we're so blessed to know who they are. So I'm going to now turn this over to my esteemed colleague, Marguerite LeBron.
Thank you, Tula. That was lovely. Thank you so much. And thank you everyone for having us here today. It's an honor to be here. So thank you again. My name is Marguerite LeBron, and I'm one of Zion's wardens. And I've been part of this research into Zion's history since 2020. I'd like to share with you what we know and what we don't know about Margaret Pine. As we'll see, it's a challenge to get an accurate picture of her life because almost everything we have learned comes to us from the point of view of white men. When I get overwhelmed and confused about my topic, I remember the voice of Detective Joe Friday from Dragnet saying, "All we want are the facts, ma'am, just the facts." And so that's what I'm here to do. Just give you the facts. The person you see in the portrait is Wynant Van Zant Jr., the man who donated the land on which Zion Episcopal Church stands and who helped to build the church. His name is crucial to the story of Margaret Pine because she was one of 4 people who were enslaved within his household. On June 21st, 1788, Wynant married Maria Allaire Underhill, daughter of Israel Underhill of Westchester County. It appears that upon Maria's marriage to Wynant, her father presented her with 4 enslaved people of African descent: Charles Pine, Caesar, Elsie, and Margaret Pine. In the Underhill genealogy, published in the 1920s, we learned that this gift was recorded in the Van Zant family Bible. We also learned that this page of the Bible was later torn out. At this time, slavery was widespread in New York State and throughout New England. The Port of New York was a major hub for trade, including the trade of enslaved human beings. Our research revealed that Wynant Van Zant made his fortune as a merchant engaged in global trade. We have no record that he traded in human beings, but he certainly did buy and sell the products of enslaved labor, including sugar and rum from the Caribbean. Records show that he was also an alderman in New York City, which is kind of like being a city council member and an elected position. From this, we can infer that he was a well-respected member of the community. In addition, he was elected a vestryman of Trinity Church in Manhattan from 1806 to 1811. In 1813, Wynant, Maria, and their family moved from New York City to a 120-acre farm in Little Neck, Long Island, or as it is now called, Douglaston. By this time, they had had 11 sons. And in 1830, the Van Zants gifted the land and the grounds on which Zion Church stands. The founding of Zion in 1830 was made possible by this gift. Wynant's remains and those of some of his family members are interred beneath the church building. This plaque, which occupies a location of importance above the west entrance door, is dedicated to the memory of the man who helped to establish the church in what was then called Little Neck. But what about Margaret Pine and the other people that Wynant and Maria enslaved? What happened to them? As I said earlier, during the course of our research, we discovered that it is very difficult to learn about enslaved people and the details of their lives. We do not know what happened to Caesar. We have no mention of him outside the Underhill genealogy. We do not know if he was ever freed, if he was sold to another enslaver, or if he died while enslaved. We know that Elsie and Charles Pine were manumitted, freed by Wynant Van Zandt in 1816. But Margaret Pine is a fascinating case because in some ways we have a lot of information about her. We know that she died on August 4th, 1857 in Lower Manhattan, and that she is buried in Greenwood Cemetery in Brooklyn in a Van Zandt family plot. The inscription on her gravestone is very weathered, but it has been analyzed and deciphered by the cemetery staff. It reads, Margaret Pine, a slave to the family of Wynant Van Zandt, deceased, formerly of Little Neck, Long Island, died August 4th, 1857, aged 80 years. We also have a newspaper article written about her death, originally printed in the Brooklyn Star. Why was her death newsworthy? Because the article claims Margaret Pine was the last slave in the state of New York. Let's take a look at what the article tells us. Margaret Pine, a slave belonging to the family of Wynant Van Zandt, deceased, formerly of Little Neck, Long Island, departed this life on the 4th, aged 79 years. She was born in Westchester County in 1778. She was presented to Mr. Van Zandt by his father in her comparative infancy. The article was likely based on the account of Dr. Charles A. Van Zandt, one of Wynant's sons. The article is based on his perspective. According to Charles, Margaret Pine had acted in the capacity of nurse to the whole family of sons, there having been 11 of them. Charles's portrait of Margaret reflects his nostalgia for his childhood home life. He evidently appreciated his nurse enough to pay for her to be buried with his own family in Greenwood Cemetery and to have her own headstone. But his love is inflected by a sentimental racism. He describes her as having black skin, but a pure soul. She lived like a sincere Christian to the last, quote. There is no friction or struggle to be found here, except around the question of whether or not Margaret was ever manumitted, freed from her enslavement. According to the article, Margaret did not want to move with the family from Manhattan to the country. So again, according to this article, Van Zandt offered to manumit her. But, quote, Margaret refused to be manumitted. She told her master when he proposed to do so that he had her services for the best part of her life and that she wished him to take care of her as long as she lived, and he willingly consented, end quote. The article goes on to say that Van Zandt instead gave Margaret permission to move back to Manhattan alone with a letter to the following effect. Quote, the bearer, Margaret Pine, is my servant. She has lived with me from her infancy. She is sober, honest, and faithful, but is averse to living in the country. She has my permission to go to New York for the purpose of going out to service and to receive her wages until this permission is revoked by me, of which due notice will be given to any person or persons in whose employ she may be. I further declare that it is my wish, and I am now willing to manumit her according to law. Given under my hand at Little Neck Farm, this 16th day of September, 1813, signed Wynette Van Zandt. It is not difficult to imagine that at the time of the New York State Gradual Emancipation Bill in 1799, all enslaved people yearned for freedom. But those who were freed still faced a hard and troublesome road. There were very few economic opportunities for free Black people, and they were starting life from scratch. Indeed, many were barred from practicing the trades and skills they had acquired during their years of bondage. After all the labor that had been stolen from them, they had no property, no assets, no money, no home. Could Margaret Pine have called on Wynette Van Zandt to provide some kind of safety net for her, even as she left his service to begin her own life of freedom? Did that entail some kind of financial support, back wages for labor that the Van Zandts had stolen from her? Or was it simply a letter of the kind that is described in this article, which she might present to anyone who hassled her? Did she wager that she would enjoy more legal protection as the property of a wealthy white man than she would as a free Black woman living alone in a city where slave catchers roamed? Such a letter explains why Charles Van Zandt believed that Margaret remained enslaved to his family even after the emancipation of all people enslaved to New York residents on July 4th, 1827. Legally, Margaret was freed on that date. We cannot be sure, but the story of this letter suggests that underneath Charles's rose-tinted depiction of his beloved nurse, we might glimpse a canny and confident woman who demanded the support she deserved from a family that had enslaved her entire life. Margaret Pine lived for 45 years after leaving the Van Zandt household. We have no record that she ever married or had children. She worked as a washerwoman and likely worked until the day she died. I will now turn things over to Father Carl to tell us a bit about Elsye Pine.
Thank you, Marguerite. I'm Father Carl Adair. I'm the assistant rector at Zion, and it's been a real privilege to work with this team over the last couple of years. So what Marguerite just shared so concisely and powerfully, there's a lot of information there that we were able to come upon quite quickly. What we know about Margaret Pine, we learned within a few months of beginning to research this. But we had no luck finding anything else about Elsie, Charles, or Caesar. And given how few records have been preserved about enslaved people and indeed about free Black people in the 18th and 19th centuries, we basically assumed that the other people that our founders enslaved were lost to history. But last summer, I was looking back at a blog post by a historian at the Greenwood Cemetery who had written about Margaret Pine. And the post had been updated to include a marriage record that the author had found, not for Margaret Pine, who never married, but for Elsye Pine, who we believe to have been Margaret's sister. So here's a clip from the published register of Grace Episcopal Church in the town of Jamaica, New York, which is here in Queens County. On October 23rd, 1813, a man named Cato Bates married Elsie Van Zandt, and the record specifies that they were both Blacks. So at the time, it was not uncommon for enslaved people to be registered with the surname of people who had enslaved them. We're pretty sure that this is Elsye Pine by another name. And this entry in the Grace Church Register opened up a whole new area of inquiry for us. My first thought was that if Elsie and Cato married, maybe they had children, and maybe those children had children, and they had children, and we might be able to identify living descendants of the people that our founders enslaved and to reach out to them in a spirit of reconciliation and repair. It does seem that Elsie and Cato never had children, so that path for the moment is closed to us. But we have been able to piece together a few facts about Elsie's life that inspire us and call us as a church community to new forms of action and transformation. So after her marriage to Cato Bates in 1813, Elsie returned to the Van Zandts, who enslaved her for another 3 years. We have this record of her manumission. We saw this before from 1816, and it seems that Elsie then joined her husband at the home that he owned about 2 miles south of the Van Zandt estate in an area called the Alley. So up north, that's the Van Zandt estate near where Zion is today. And down south at that arrow, that's the Alley, where there was a small but tight-knit free Black community. You can see here from this map that those underlined names, Rebels, Peterson, those are neighbors to Cato Bates's plot, Cato and Elsie, where they lived. And if you just go up that road, Alley Road, you come to a pond where there was a grist mill and likely some other craftspeople at work, a general store. Just north of that is this swampy marshland that the indigenous people of this area had been oystering and clamming for centuries. And we know that many free Black people joined them in that work, and that was one of the major economic engines for this free Black community. And census records say that the Bates household was employed in some kind of agriculture. So this is a map from 1933, much later, but it says who used to own this land? Hottentot, Bates, Horton, Williams, Abmeyer. These are all people that we know were formerly enslaved or part of this free Black community. And we also know that in the late 1830s, members of this free Black community began moving 6 miles southwest to the growing urban center of Jamaica. As Mother Lindsay said earlier, Jamaica is the seat of Queens County. It's a major transit hub. If you've ever flown in or out of John F. Kennedy Airport, you have been to Jamaica. And obviously the airport wasn't there in the 1830s, and Jamaica then was a smaller community, like a large village. But it was home to a free Black community that was increasingly organized and increasingly politically active. Cato's cousin, Alexander Horton, who he lived next door to in the Alley, Alexander Horton bought a house on South Street in Jamaica in 1837, and his property abutted that of a man named Wilson Rantis. And Rantis was a vocal abolitionist and an advocate for Black education and Black suffrage. And he was near the center of this burgeoning movement for the Black vote. And it seems that Cato and Elsie became a part of this network even while they were living 6 miles away in the Alley. In 1841, Cato was one of the signatories to this call to the colored freemen of Long Island for a convention to be held at Jamaica, Queens County, in November of 1841. Now, this was the first convention of free Black men to gather locally to organize for the right to vote in New York State. And in the next few years, they inspired other small local conventions, which then culminated in a state convention in Troy, New York, I believe in 1848. At this meeting of the Episcopal Women's History Project, it should be noted that as a woman, Elsie would probably not have been welcome in this organization, which was exclusively focused on the right to vote for Black men. But like many other women who have worked unacknowledged behind the scenes of civil rights struggles, she was a part of it. You'll notice down here, Cato Bates's name is circled, but you'll also notice that Wilson Rantis is the signatory, as is Samuel V. Berry at the top there. Maybe some folks from the Union of Black Episcopalians may even know this name. But Samuel B. Berry had graduated from General Theological Seminary, I think in 1832. And we haven't connected all the dots yet, but we do know that in 1837, Berry was in Jamaica and he founded the St. Mark's Free Episcopal Colored School. Like many people many Black men who were called to the priesthood at this time, Berry had a long road to ordination. He was not ordained a deacon until 1846. But even in this late 1830s in Jamaica, it seemed that he had leadership responsibilities in a congregation of Black Episcopalians that was connected to St. Mark's School and that was supervised and also intentionally segregated from Grace Episcopal Church in Jamaica. And remember, that's the church where Elsie and Cato were married in 1813. 20 plus years later, it seems that they were unable to worship in that church. The point that I'm making here with all these facts is that in the 1830s and 1840s, Cato and Elsie were part of a local movement for Black political representation and civil rights. And that movement was also deeply tied to a local congregation of Black Episcopalians. They're right in the thick of it. So in 1849, Cato and Elsie moved to Jamaica as well. They sold about 3/4 of the land that they owned in the alley, but held on to the deed for about 1/4 of that land, and we'll come back to this in a moment. When they got to Jamaica, it seems like they rented an apartment for a year or two, and then in 1852, they bought a piece of property with a house on it on Beaver Street. That's down here on the left-hand corner of this, lower left-hand corner of this map. They bought this home from a white man named Isaac Simonson, and they paid $350. And then just 2 years later, they sold the property back to Isaac Simonson for a $50 loss. And that's a lot of money. Why would they have done that? And what does this matter for the legacy of Elsye Pine at Zion? So we have 2 clues which might tell us something about Cato and Elsie's experience as free Black people in antebellum New York. The first clue is that this house on Beaver Street was quite distant from the free Black community that clustered around Douglas Street, way over on the eastern side of Jamaica. That's where Alexander, that little red box that's outlined in that map, if you can see up close, that's Alexander Horton's house. And he lives right next door to Wilson Rantis. So that's the center of Black life and political action in Jamaica. And Cato and Elsie live way over on the other side of town. And from census records, it seems like they were one of the very few Black people who lived on that side of town, that it was an overwhelmingly white neighborhood. Here's the second clue to why they might have sold. One of the other Black people living on their side, the west side of town, was a man named Benjamin W. Bates. And for a while, they're unrelated. For a while, we chased the thought that maybe he could be Cato and Elsie's son, but the professional genealogist who has been working with us has assured us that that's not the case. Benjamin W. Bates worked as a waiter in Jamaica, perhaps also in Manhattan, and he was also part of political activity. In 1853, he drafted this public letter, a petition for safety. I apologize that we only have a digital copy here of just the text, but this is a plea from the Black community to the trustees of the village of Jamaica for legal and physical protection from white mobs who harass people of color going about their daily business. The petition alludes to a group of men who would gather in or around the house of a Mr. Hollins, to drink and swear, and then go around beating up Black people who are bringing their groceries home. The petition prays, they use the word prays, that the law of this town and county may be instructed upon such persons, so that the Black community would not be beaten by this body or club of men. So let's do a little bit of math here. 1852, Elsie and Cato buy a home from Isaac Simonson in a part of town where they're living isolated among white families. In 1853, this petition is published describing unprovoked and unchecked white violence against Black people. And then in 1854, Cato and Elsie sell their home for a loss and move into a rental somewhere else in Jamaica. It seems very possible that Cato and Elsie were made to feel unwelcome and indeed unsafe in the home that they owned and basically had to flee. We don't know that's the case, but that's the provisional conclusion that we're coming to. One of the things in a sort of note about research, the phrases that has this genealogist we've been working with has come up with is that, you know, in the search for historical records, how is a person of interest to the courts? So buying and selling property, that is of interest to the courts. After Cato and Elsie sold this property, they no longer became they were no longer of interest to the courts. So we don't have any records of the 10 years that they lived longer. We know that between 1860 and 1862 that Cato dies. But at the time, New York State did not keep death records, so we don't know when and we don't know where he or Elsie were buried. Elsie dies in 1864. But, and this is something that we have discovered or been alerted to just in the last few weeks. So I'm sharing with you like the cutting edge of what we know in our pursuit here. Remember that land that Cato and Elsie held onto in the alley, the quarter of their property? It seems that several of their neighbors in that free Black community, cousins, close friends, who owned land that all abutted each other, many of them did the same thing. They preserved a portion of their land when they sold it and moved to Jamaica. And that land was sort of, the pieces of that land fit together. We also know that, that in deeds of sale, Cato and Elsie and others retained a right-of-way, 4-foot wide path from the road to this piece of property set back from the road. And it's very clear from other records that they intended to use this as a burial ground. This is where they intended to be buried. And that site is still less than 2 miles south of where Zion stands, and it has never been developed. You can see 2 aerial photos here. The outline of the land on a sort of modern map is here, and this area marked with the X, all of this wooded area, that's what we're talking about. Here's what it looks like from the street. We still have more work to do to confirm this, but it is likely that we have identified the final resting place of one of the people that our founders enslaved. And so it falls to us to discern how to show her proper honor and to ensure that her memory is never again forgotten or erased. Before I turn this back to Mother Lindsay for conclusion, I want to say that I was really moved by something that Marguerite said just the other day as we were preparing this presentation. Given the illustrious women who have often been profiled in this Lenten series, we were talking about how it's a little strange that we're presenting about Margaret and Elsye Pine given how little we know about them, and given that they did not make much of a mark upon their world. And of course, in many ways, Margaret and Elsie were prevented from making such a mark by enslavement and by the structural racism that they experienced quite acutely as free Black women in the early 19th century. But Marguerite said that she believes that Margaret and Elsie's legacy has yet to begin, and it will begin with us. Their influence is being felt now, and part of their legacy will be the way that we work for justice now, in this time, in their memories. Mother Lindsay, back to you.
Thanks, Father Carl. You know, once we learned all of these things and our parish's participation in American slavery, those are things we can't unknow or unsee. We know them now. And that means we're faced with a choice. We can just forget about it or sweep it under the rug because it's kind of tarnishes our beautiful story, or we can claim it and live into it, which is what we're trying to do now. One way we want to not forget this part of our story and to incorporate it into our lives today, and to resist the temptation of glossing over it, is sharing our own stories and making a personal connection with it. So one thing we do is we did a podcast. Our parish does have a podcast, and you can find it on our website. It's called Thin Places. And we chose our second season of our podcast to explore stories of parishioners who have discovered something about themselves and then made a change, and what that crossing that threshold of a change look like for their own lives and their own transformation. And then we made the shift to look at our parish's story and some of the parts of our story that are shameful, and how do we learn from that, tell that story, ask for forgiveness, and then move into a new way of being as transformed people. So I invite you to check that out and hear some of those stories. Another way we are making sure that we don't let these stories be forgotten and this history, part of our history, be forgotten, is we are installing a memorial in our sanctuary. As you can see at the top of that doorway, there is currently a memorial to Wynant Van Zandt and his family, and we do want to continue to remember them and their legacy as founders of this parish. But we also want to remember the 41, maybe even more, people who were enslaved by our founding members, not only the Van Zandt family, but other founding families. So as we wrap up this presentation, I'd like to share with you the words that will be on this memorial that will be put into our sanctuary. So Giselle, would you read the words for the memorial?
Yeah, so our memorial goes as follows. We know that at least 43 people were enslaved by Zion's founding families. These children of God were taken far from their African homeland. They had dignity that was denied. They deserved justice that was withheld from them. It was wrong. We confess that Zion was founded with wealth created by the forced labor of enslaved people. We confess that over the course of Zion's history, we also allowed ourselves to forget them. We remember them here and now. We commit to defending their memory and protecting the dignity of every human being. As the people of Zion, we seek to be faithful to the journey towards justice. Christ have mercy. We would talk about our research project, or we could talk about our research project for hours, but we invite you guys to also, at this time, ask any questions.
You can use the chat feature to ask your questions, and I'll take a look at them and ask our Zion History Project team. So I'm just taking a look now. So we welcome your questions.
Joan Gunderson has written a comment that I wish you'd comment on.
I can jump in on that just quickly. Yeah, so
Okay.
Joan notes that in the 1840s, many women were actively pushing for temperance and for broader access to education. And Elsie may well have been involved with that as well. And that's certainly the case. And it also points us to some of the problems with or the challenges of working with historical records. Let's just take the records of the archive that we have at Zion Episcopal Church in Douglaston, Queens, as one example. This parish has been around for almost 200 years. We're very lucky to have all of the vestry minutes going back to 1830, all of the records of the annual meeting, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We haven't lost any in a fire or been damaged by flood. Very few parishes that are as old as we are can say that. But those were the minutes, those are the records of meetings that were largely led and run by men, which is not at all the complete scope of what Zion's ministries have been, what the people of Zion have been up to. I don't need to tell any of you that Episcopal Church women have been making things happen in the church, making ministry happen, and many of the records of those ministries have not been preserved, because who does the preserving and who decides what matters? Decisions about financial expenditures around the churchyard, I guess that matters. How many people came to an ice cream social or were part of a baptism class led by laywomen? Those aren't the kind of things that have been often been preserved by history. So this is a really important question that Joan is raising. And unfortunately, we might expect that the records of women's work for temperance and education, or indeed for the vote in 1830s and 40s, is even less likely to have survived than the work of Black men.
Right.
Great. We have some questions in the chat and also some suggestions of where to look to do some more research. It looks like it says a possibility that Zion will include Lift Every Voice hymnals in the sanctuary as a living tribute to the memory. That's a really wonderful idea. We have been using more music composed by people of color in our worship in the last few years. And that's very important to us. And that's a really wonderful idea. So thank you for that. Also, there's a question about the rectors after Van Zandt who enslaved people. The rector did not enslave anyone, but the founding lay members, the people who built the church and raised the money to start this church. And I don't know if Marguerite or Father Carl can say more specifically about how many of those founding families enslaved people. Could one of you fill us in a little bit more?
I'd be happy to speak on that a little bit. To my knowledge, there were about 17 founding families, and of those, through checking the Northeast slavery record data, we found that at least 12 of those families held enslaved people within their households, and that they totaled to be about 43 human souls. The other question about, whether the rectors held enslaved people. In 1827, New York State had their completion of their gradual emancipation bill. And after that time, no new slaves were to be made. And those who were supposed to be freed for women upon reaching the age of 25 and for men upon reaching the age of 28. That's what I know so far. And again, as to the rectors, we didn't have a record of any of the rectors having enslaved people. Thank you.
So it looks like, thank you, Joan, for your question. The New York Gradual Emancipation Act allowed families to hold children born after the date of the passage as indentured servants until they were adults. So the question is, were the Van Zants freeing the enslaved people when they reached that age? I think from what we know is we just know of the 4 people, Elsie, Caesar, Margaret, and Charles. Those are the names we have. And it looks like they were manumitted before the Emancipation Act. But as for the other people that are part of our memorial that our founders enslaved, I don't know. Marguerite or Father Carl, do you have information? We don't know a whole lot. We only have the names of a few people.
Yeah, I think, all of these records are incomplete. So when we made our count of signatories to Zion's Articles of Incorporation and whether or not there were records attached to those names or those families around enslavement, one kind of record that we came upon was the registration of the birth of a child to an enslaved woman. So we have an 1807 record that a woman who's identified only by her first name, Coney, gave birth to a baby boy whose name was Isaac. And the reason why it was important to legally register such a child is that, as Joan pointed out in an earlier question, even though the Gradual Emancipation Act was supposed to emancipate enslaved people in the state of New York on July 4th, 1827, children born between 1799 and 1827 still needed to fulfill an indentured servitude to the family that enslaved their mother until the age of 25 for women, the age of 28 for men. So Isaac, born in 1807, could have legally been held in bondage by, I'm forgetting the name of the, I think Richard Allen was the name of the Zion founder who enslaved Coney. He could have legally held Isaac in bondage until 1834, or whatever the math is, beyond 1827. So Zion was founded in 1830. It's possible that members of the Zion congregation still had enslaved people living in their households. We don't yet know if that was the case or not. With the Van Zant family, we don't know what happened to Caesar. We have this complicated story about whether or not Margaret was manumitted in 1813, and we know that Charles and Elsie were manumitted in 1816.
I would love it if some of the members of the Zion History Project wouldn't mind getting a little personal and sharing what this process of doing the history and digging for facts, how have the facts transformed how you see yourself? What spiritual, what are you learning more about yourself and God from this research, from this story?
Okay, yeah. Hi, I can speak to that. I think it's been very liberating to know that this history of so many, enslaved people, which has just been washed away and twisted and turned, is really being appreciated, and their contributions are a part of the church now. I personally have really enjoyed working with the committee. I haven't been as into the facts as Marguerite in sense of looking through the facts, but I really feel like I am connected to Margaret and to Elsie, because as you know, as a Black female, I can feel their pain, their struggles, and I put my life to say if it was me in that time, how I would have to try to negotiate a church and then being enslaved, and that's the only life I knew. So it's been very, very liberating. And the memorial, we did have a pre-memorial celebration. And then just to hear Mother Lindsay and Father Carl talk about these 43, and each person was named unknown, unknown, unknown. And to hear this 40 something times, and you hear like maybe Cato and Elsie and Margaret, but just to hear their names, it just made it more alive, much more alive to me.
Thank you, Tula. We have just a few minutes. I don't know if the hosts want to close with anything, but thank you so much for listening. This is an ongoing process that we will be unpacking both literally with information and archives, but also unpacking personally and as a community, what this means, not only for our past, but what it means for our future and how to be the kinds of people that God wants us to be living into the future. Thank you so much.
Are there any further questions? I personally want to say how moved I have been to hear this story. It's very powerful to know that this is not an unusual story, unfortunately. It went on too many times in too many places, but you're at the forefront of discovering the history, and hopefully it will inspire other parishes to do what you have done and discover all the wonderful things and the painful things at the same time. So thank you very much. I hope that you all will be back with us next week when Christina Brenna Lee is going to talk about Mary Ringwald, unsuspecting mystic. So see you next week at the same place at 3 o'clock for the next installment of our Lenten series. Have a blessed Lent. Thank you.